Good morning! Welcome back to my kitchen. My name is Terry and I am the Shield Maiden. Today is kind of the first full day of fall, even though technically it started yesterday, early in the morning. And I decided I am going to make some English muffins. Not just English muffins, but sourdough English muffins. So that's why I'm getting started early, because as some of you probably know, if you make recipes using sourdough, it often requires you to let the dough sit for several hours, and that's definitely the case with this. It's actually a very simple recipe. It's pretty quick, with the exception of the hours that you've got in the middle there, letting the dough rest. But since it's also English muffins, of course, I'm going to weave Vikings in there because that's what I do. I'm a historian and I study Vikings. And so, as many of you might know, if you're interested in Vikings, they had a definite effect on the UK. And as a matter of fact, they are a large part of the reason why it's even called the UK, as in a united nation, particularly where England is concerned. So England, English muffins weren't invented by Vikings, but Vikings had a hand in inventing England. So that's where I'm going to go with this today. And so you can see I've got some of the ingredients laid out here. And again, it's very simple. So here we'll take a look. We're going to have half a cup of sourdough starter. And so that's my starter here I've got in my jar that perpetually lives on my counter. And we've got flour, and this is just regular all-purpose flour. There'll be 3 cups of that. There'll be a bit of salt. There will be a bit of milk in there, and I use whole milk. As a matter of fact, why didn't I get the milk out? I should have done that, right? All right, so here we are, whole milk. And then honey, just a little bit, a tablespoon, but I'm lucky enough to have honey from my own bees out at our Christmas tree farm. And then a little bit of cornmeal, and I've got some polenta here. It's all I have, but as you probably know, polenta is just coarse cornmeal. So I can grind this up a little bit in order to dust the bottoms and the tops of the English muffins. And then you'll see I've got a couple of different configurations here of cast iron skillet. One is kind of more of a griddle, just a flat thing without sides. And then your regular, just kind of 10, 12-inch cast iron skillet. This is what I use. You could also use a non-stick skillet, but mine are well seasoned, so effectively they are non-stick. But you will be cooking the English muffins on something like this, and it will not be greased when you cook it, so you definitely need to have something that is a non-stick type of surface. So that's what we have as far as getting going and getting things started. So stay tuned and we'll start to put this stuff together and talk a little bit about Vikings and their effect on the history of England. Okay, so we're going to assemble the ingredients, and we're going to put everything into this large bowl except the cornmeal. So we'll get started with the half a cup of sourdough starter. And if you don't have sourdough starter and you're just sort of beginning this, you can certainly Google that. Mine is just simply a mix of flour and water that has been sitting, and you have to wait about a week before you can use it once you get started from scratch. But it's worth it if you like sourdough stuff. And mine's been living on my counter, like I mentioned, for probably about 3 years at least. And I've been through a couple different iterations. So we've got a half cup of starter and then 1 tablespoon of honey, which is always fun to get into the bowl. Get all over your hands and everything. All right, and then good stuff. We have 1 cup of milk. I use whole milk, but you can use any kind of milk that you want. And then I'm gonna just kind of mix that a little bit just to kind of loosen up that honey. And then we're going to put in 1 teaspoon of salt. And then we will put in 3 cups of flour. And again, this is just regular all-purpose flour, not bread flour. All right. And then the recipe actually says to mix it well with your hands. I'm going to use this wooden spoon and kind of get it started. And while I'm doing that, then I will tell you a little story about, well, so English muffins, as some of you may know, and you can certainly Google this. You probably heard of Thomas's English muffins. So Mr. Thomas was actually a British expat who emigrated to the United States in the 1870s and ended up working at a bakery and, effectively invented what we call an English muffin, at least in the United States. And so, he's part of that story. But, I'm a Viking person, so I'm going Vikings and England. And the Viking Age, as some of you know, runs from the 8th century to around the year 1100. If you asked a person in England what the Viking Age was, especially a scholar in more, not in more recent years, but maybe in times past, this is kind of changing now, but there's certainly an Anglo-centric aspect to what we consider the Viking Age, even though the Vikings are a Scandinavian phenomenon. So AD 793 and AD 1066. Those are the front end and the back end of the Viking Age, if you ask a lot of people. If you learn about the Viking Age in the English-speaking world, that is generally the time frame that you're going to be confronted with. But is this accurate? Actually, not quite. And we're learning a lot more about particularly the beginnings of the Viking Age that is starting to change this picture. So why 793 and why 1066? Well, if you know anything about medieval history, especially regarding England, you'll know that 1066 is a very famous Battle of Hastings. So, you can Google that if you don't know what that is, but that's a really important battle for affecting the history of England going forward at that time. But why 793? Well, in the year 793, as is recounted by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is a long-standing historical document that's created back at that time that really basically documents various aspects of the history of England, we have a notable record that talks about this essentially attack on this place called Lindisfarne, which is in the very northeastern part on the coast of England, not very far from the border with Scotland. There was a Christian monastery there, and Vikings attacked that monastery and that community in the year 793, and it was very terrifying. They killed people, they stole things, they took some people captive. But actually, this isn't even the first note of a Viking raid in England. There's one just 4 years earlier in the south of England in a place called Portland, which is interesting because that's where I am from. That's where I am right now. And not in England, but in Oregon. And so, the Vikings have been doing things in England since the, late 8th century, for sure. We know they were doing things in other parts of that world much earlier than that now. But for whatever reason, these dates really had caught on, particularly in the academic community. And so as history gets taught, and then I think probably as a matter of maybe English pride or something, it kind of catches on and just sort of keeps going and gets perpetuated that the Viking Age really is starting with these important raids, particularly the one on Lindisfarne in the year 793. Well, what happens as a result of that? Well, it absolutely opens up an onslaught of Scandinavian activity in the British Isles. So it's not just exclusive to England. They were very active in Scotland. They were also active in Wales, and they were also active in Ireland as well. But they end up creating a period of time that lasts for quite a long time in wreaking a bunch of havoc in England and, moving there permanently sometimes. So settlement happens. They are stealing things from people. They are, so it's the raiding, but there's also trading that's going on at the same time. That's part of it. Ultimately, they're going to intermarry with the English. And so, we have a situation where by the time we get to the late 800s, there's really a lot of connection between Scandinavia and England, and it's going to fall to primarily members of what is known as the House of Wessex, which was the English kingdom in the south and primarily the southwest of England, hence the name Wessex. And that family is going to be ultimately responsible for trying to unite the other English kingdoms, of which there were 5 at the time, in order to try to fight back against the Scandinavian diaspora that was hitting their shores in kind of a continuous way by a certain point in time. And so, it will become Alfred the Great, who you may have heard of his name if you know anything about English history in this period of time. Very important king in the history of England, whose descendants, he kind of gets the ball rolling, but his descendants will then be responsible for creating a united England. And in large part, it has to do with trying to unite against the Scandinavians who were coming in their mind, probably seeming like they were taking over. And there will be a little bit more to that story, so I'll talk a little bit about how that shapes up here in just a few moments. But so we've got our sourdough English muffin dough that is now mixed up together, as you can see. So just kind of a, mid-sized ball, I guess. And so what we do at first here as this first step is we basically just leave it in this bowl, cover it, and then let it rest at room temperature for about 45 to 60 minutes. So I'm going to do that, and then we'll pick up on the other side. Okay, so our dough has been resting for about 45 minutes to an hour, and you give or take, that extra 15 minutes doesn't harm anything if you let it go a little bit longer. We've got a much longer rest that's to come, so it'll be all right. You can see I've covered it with what I call these little shower caps, but you can buy them in the grocery store. I actually bought a package of them that had various sizes in it, so you can use it for different sizes of bowls. But I find these to be really handy. They're really inexpensive, and you can then just wash it and reuse it. If you don't have this, of course, cling film works just fine, or even laying a towel across it. But save it if you're using this or whatever your cover is, because we'll need to do that again. And so in this next phase of it, we're basically just going to take our dough and we're going to put it out here onto this floured surface, so lightly floured surface. And then we're going to knead it. Generally by hand is good. If you don't want to do that or can't do that for some reason, if you have a stand mixer, you can also use that. And the stand mixer, if you use the dough hook attachment and set it on low setting, then you should be fine, because then that kind of will mimic, what you can do with your hands. And you knead it for about 5 minutes. And so while I do this, I will go ahead and start talking a little bit again about the Viking history. So, and the Viking connection with England. And I mentioned, this idea about England and the Viking Age being, sort of 793 to 1066, and that this is a very Anglo-centric kind of dating system, because the Vikings went pretty far and wide, and so it really depends on where you're talking about. But a lot of times this is what you're going to read in history books or online. And so, yeah, all of those, the bookend of those dates takes place in England, 793 with the raid on Lindisfarne, but then 1066 with the Battle of Hastings. If you know anything about English history, that's a very famous battle. But Scandinavians were a very felt presence during the course of the Viking Age in England. And as a matter of fact, as I said at the outset, they actually play a role in forcing the creation of a single polity that is known as the country of England, or the Kingdom of England. And this will happen by the time you get into the early 900s. So the 800s is a very important period of time, particularly the end or the second half of the 800s. We've got the Viking phenomenon and the Viking threat really increasing over that period of time. And rather than just, a few ships and some guys, there's lots of ships and lots of guys. And so that by the time you get to the 860s, what's showing up in England is something that becomes historically known as the Great Heathen Army, at least from the English standpoint, because they were mostly Christian and the Scandinavians were not at that time. And so heathen is a very much an epithet, but so the Great Army, as historians will often refer to it as well, which is a bunch of bands of Scandinavian chieftains and their warriors who are coming to England to fight, to raid, to see what they can get a hold of for themselves, and in some cases to eventually settle and assimilate there. And so that gets going in the 860s, and then by 878, the Wessex King Alfred, who becomes known as Alfred the Great, actually manages to defeat some Vikings in Wessex. And so the Scandinavians are not always successful, and the English have the upper hand, at least periodically. There does end up being a couple of years later, or a few years later in the 880s, a treaty with a Viking chieftain known as Guthrum, who ultimately actually becomes Christian as well. This is a really key period of time for that, because again, Scandinavia is not Christian. And so slowly that conversion process will begin to happen. But the assimilation into England for Scandinavians and people like the Viking Guthrum and his men will be, have Christianity as part of that political process, actually. And so then Alfred the Great actually dies in 899. But it will be up to his son, Edward, and then his grandson, Ethelstan, who will continue the fight against the Scandinavian onslaught. There will be created a thing known as the Danelaw that will be in the eastern part of England, which will effectively be a territory that the English give to the Scandinavians, kind of in an attempt to appease them, to say, here, stop harassing us. We'll give you this part of our country. You can live there in accordance with your own laws and your own customs, but just stay over there. And you'll see what the Danelaw looks like on this map. And so generally the Danelaw had a capital of York, which is still a town that exists in England, and you can go there and see lots of Viking artifacts. It's a very important Scandinavian/Viking town. And so, they hold sway there for quite a long time, actually roughly, a century or almost 2 centuries. Before the English, fully take that part of the country back. But of course it would be irrevocably changed, because the assimilation meant that Scandinavian traditions and place names and things like that will have taken root and indeed are still part of English history as well. In the year 925, though, Ethelstan, who is Alfred the Great's grandson, ultimately is successful in uniting the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms against the Scandinavians and, effectively becoming what historians know as the first king of England, like all of England as a united territory. So it really is that whole sort of 9th and early 10th century is the unfolding of a very complex story about a culture clash between the English, the Anglo-Saxons, and the Scandinavians, and also the process of state building, and of course Christianity as kind of underpinning all of that as the religious tradition at the time. If you're really interested in this, even though it's historical fiction, I think the books and then the subsequent TV series that was made related to it, called The Last Kingdom by Bernard Cornwell, does a really good job. And for my money, especially if you watch the TV series, the man who plays Alfred the Great, the King of Wessex, in it is fantastic. So, and again, it's historical fiction. So, but the basis of it is this story that I'm telling you here about the Scandinavian threat to Anglo-Saxon England for a very long period of time. And then in the early 11th century, even though the English will ultimately take over their own country, the Scandinavians won't be done. The Vikings will be back, and we'll actually have Viking kings becoming the King of England by the time you get into the very early 11th century, with a famous man known as Svein Forkbeard and his relative, then his son Canute the Great, who will be King of England until the year 1035 upon his death. So, and then they're not done yet. So then the end of this Viking Age dating of 1066 that I mentioned with the Battle of Hastings, well, of course, as some of you know, the Battle of Hastings is due to a man named William, the Duke of Normandy, who decides to sail across the English Channel from northwestern France in the region of Normandy, and engages in a very big battle where he kills the last Anglo-Saxon king, and he becomes then the King of England. And even though he comes from France, he very much has Viking Scandinavian roots, because his ancestor from 150 years prior was actually given that territory of Normandy to settle by the Frankish emperor. So, I mean, it's a very interesting intertwined history where Scandinavians play a big role, and not just Scandinavians, but legit Vikings play a big role in the formation of the country that we now know as England. Okay, so that's about enough of that kneading. And now what we're going to do with our English muffin dough is to put it back into the bowl. And then this is where we're going to have the very long rest. So we cover it, and it's going to then sit for about 8 to 10 hours. And if any of you have done any other cooking with sourdough, you know this is often the case, like making sourdough bread and things like that. So it takes a much longer time for it to kind of ferment and to rise a bit, rather than if you were using modern, like instant rise yeast and stuff. So, all right, I will put the ball back into my bowl, put my little cover back on. And that will just sit right there and ferment at room temperature. So we'll check back in a few hours. Okay, all those hours of fermenting now have taken place. And again, it can be anywhere roughly from, say, 8 to 10 or 11 hours. Just depends on, how much time you have. And also, like with a lot of sourdough recipes, you actually can do sort of a time saver and not have to crunch everything into one day. If you want to make this a little bit later in the afternoon, you can just pop it in the refrigerator overnight and let it ferment there. That's good. Just bring it out to room temperature for maybe an hour or two before you start working on this next step, which we're going to do now. And that is, so take our cover off and pull the dough out. And it's a really nice, you'll notice it's a very supple, soft dough, slightly sticky, but of course we're going to put it on a lightly floured surface here, and so that will take care of some of that. And then the next step is going to be to cut it into our shapes, our English muffin shapes. And we do that by just simply pressing the dough out so that we get it to roughly about a 1-inch thickness or so. And, ideally, probably what you're going to get maybe out of this recipe is 8 to 10. I've got, you'll see my little biscuit cutter here, which is, probably roughly a 2.5 or 3-inch cutter. So if you're using that, then yeah, that's the size that you should probably end up getting. And we'll cut these out. And then where I'm going to place them is on this baking sheet that I have prepared here. I have it lined with a piece of parchment paper, and then it's been sprinkled with a little bit of that cornmeal that I had showed at the very beginning, and then we'll be sprinkling a little bit of that on top as well. So just kind of pull it out into sort of a rough, kind of rectangle shape so that you can get the number of them that we desire, and just kind of start on the ends, pull them out, and place them on the sheet. And then I also like to give my sources because I'm a responsible historian, and so this is a recipe that I have adapted from a site that you can check out called Little Spoon Farm. Plenty of other types of sourdough recipes there to check out. I have tried some of the other ones, such as the bagels, which were also really good. So highly recommend checking out that site if you are interested in sourdough baking. As usual, I kind of fiddle with the recipe a little bit and adapt a couple of things. But otherwise, that is where it comes from. And then also, like you may have seen me do in some of my other videos, I do like to talk about sometimes, whether or not Vikings would have actually eaten what it is that I'm making. And today, the answer is totally yes. Every single one of the ingredients that I have used in this, from the regular wheat flour to a sourdough starter, or, just kind of a natural, yeast that exists in the air. can certainly be, I mean, that's kind of the beginnings of sourdough, actually, way back in history. To the honey, that they would have had or could have had from bees. As a matter of fact, that was probably their only sweetener because they live in a time prior to cane sugar really being a thing in Europe. But of course the salt, probably the only thing is the cornmeal, because corn comes from the New World, from the Americas, and they don't have access to that yet in the Viking Age. But otherwise, I mean, they're simply just making a flat bread, which is a very common thing in many human cultures. And as a matter of fact, here on my channel, you can actually check out my other video about Viking barley flatbread, because this is something as well that we know that they ate, and it has barley flour instead of just this regular all-purpose wheat flour that is part of it. It's a slightly different type of recipe. So anyway, if you're interested, feel free to check that out. So before we let this sit, then we also pour a little bit of the cornmeal or sprinkle it onto the tops as well. So do that, and very quickly we can then let it sit for the next fermenting and rising that these will do, which will be roughly an hour or so. And again, they'll be sitting at room temperature, and you want to cover them with a towel. So I've got just a nice, sort of flour sacked kind of towel here, so it won't stick to it either. So I'm just going to cover that up and leave those to sit here for an hour or so, and then we will come back and go ahead and get the skillet ready and start cooking these. Alrighty, home stretch, the last step for these English muffins, and it actually goes very quickly. So I've got my skillet here. Again, I use this cast iron skillet, but you can use any kind of non-stick skillet, and it's not greased or anything of any kind. You'll see that these have not actually quote-unquote risen. We're not using yeast again. This is sourdough, so it's a slower rise, but they have puffed up slightly. And again, we've been working at this all day. You can kind of see I got already my dinner prep going on in the background. Busy here in Shield Maiden in the kitchen. But what we'll do is I've just slightly heated this to low. And on my induction setting, I'm on 4, if you have an induction stove, and you can just simply transfer, usually like 4 of them at a time, onto the griddle or onto the skillet, and then set a timer for 4 minutes, and then we will flip them over. Okay, so these have been cooking on the first side. Let's look. And there you go. You see it's starting to get a little bit golden brown on that first side. So we're going to flip that over. And some of it's a little bit lighter. I don't know, maybe uneven heat there with my skillet or something. But so at this point, I mean, you definitely, sort of check, monitor the heat that you've got, sort of a low to medium low, see how that's working out. I actually did turn mine from 4 up to 5 when I checked to see, what kind of golden brown I was getting. And then, if you need to adjust the time just a little bit, but it only should take about 4 to 5 minutes per side. So I've turned those over. I'm going to let them go for that amount of time again, and then we'll keep moving until we finish the rest of the batch. Okay, so I've got the rest of the batch cooking, and you'll be able to see that there's the first group looking pretty good. Look like English muffins. And keep in mind that you will be probably toasting them, so cutting them and then toasting them, which will also help to cook them and kind of dry them out a little bit. They sort of feel dense and soft, and so maybe, to someone's touch, it might feel like, oh no, did I cook them long enough? But trust me, you did, and they'll be really tasty. So I'm going to keep going with the rest of this batch, and I'll stop here and just say thanks for joining me again on Shield Maiden in the Kitchen. And if you want to have more information about Vikings, please be sure to check out my podcast with my co-host CJ Adrian called Vikingology, the art and science of the Viking Age. We are on vikingology.substack.com, and we also have a YouTube channel as well. And so you can watch videos. We interview a lot of great scholars and talk about all things Viking. You can also find that on
Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and basically wherever you get your podcasts, just search for Vikingology. You can also find me in my class that I teach for medievalists.net online. So if you're interested in that kind of, more of a deeper dive into some aspects of the Viking Age, you can check that out as well. And I'll include the link in the description here. So check out the recipe below and let me know how these turn out for you and whether or not you like it. We've got a traditional flatbread that, Vikings would have eaten, even though they didn't invent English muffins. But as I said, they pretty much had a hand in inventing England. So, all right, until next time, sjamst!